Hi, it's Ty here, bringing you another episode of Lean Mean Marketing Teams. On today's episode, we have Rob Goffee, renowned author, Emeritus Professor at London Business School, and a founding partner with Creative Management Associates. Rob is a leading expert on corporate culture and leadership. He's published 11 books and written 100 articles, as well as taught executives from or consulted to some of the world's leading companies, such as Unilever, Nestle and LVMH. In today's discussion, we have a far-reaching chat about three topics that I believe are absolutely fundamental for all marketing leaders. They are: 1, how to become a more effective and authentic leader; 2, how to create a dream work environment to attract and retain a dream team; and 3rd, how to lead clever people. To get there, we go on a bit of a book odyssey of 3 books co-authored by Rob Goffee and Gareth Jones. Some of the topics I love digging into include why authenticity is a must for leaders and organizations, how being vulnerable and taking risk pays off. And we also try to answer the tricky question on how to be radically honest with staff when you don't have all the answers or when you know what a downsize or change is coming. And what you need to pay attention to as a leader to get the most from your A players in order to keep them engaged and not send them running to your competitors. What I like about this conversation is that it kind of shifts gears from being conceptual to being highly practical with real-world examples. It also moderates between some straightforward topics and answers to some messy contextual answers. This is because Rob and Gareth write their books based on industry research with CEOs and leaders from leading organisations, and they then blend that with their academic expertise in their fields of corporate culture and leadership. I think it's also because leadership and corporate culture can be messy and complex and contextual. There's never a perfect answer or silver bullet. But Rob does a fantastic job of simplifying and codifying the books and the messages into takeaways that you can definitely use and apply straight away. There's a lot of content covered in this episode, so to make it easy for you, actually create some notes just for you. Someone on our team listens to the episode and curates the best parts into a beautiful summary with all the tactics and strategies laid out, so you can spend more time taking action and less time taking notes. To grab a copy of those notes, head on over to growthgenerators.io, look out for this episode and download the notes. But you need to be quick as they're only up there for a few weeks after the show goes live. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, Ty here again. I just wanted to flag that we had a few connection issues with this episode, so the audio quality is not up to its usual 100%, but it is probably up there around 95%. You can still hear all the conversations, just a couple words might go missing here and there, but I encourage you to stick with it. There's fantastic content in this episode, and I hope you enjoy the show. Thank you.
Welcome to Lean Mean Marketing Teams with Ty Hayes, where you'll hear from leading CMOs and thought leaders about what it takes to create a high-performance marketing team. This podcast is brought to you by Growth Generators, a consulting firm that helps CMOs design and build modern marketing teams that drive growth. If you need help optimizing your marketing team, head to growthgenerators.io. Now, let's get on to the show.
Welcome, Rob Goffee, coming to us from just outside London to the Lean Mean Marketing Teams podcast.
Good to be with you.
Now, Rob, we met many years ago back when I was at London Business School, and I remember filming you about some of these books we're actually talking about. So I'm so delighted to come full circle and be able to have a deep discussion with you about them today.
I'm very pleased to be a part of your program.
Excellent. Now, Rob, you've got a fascinating career, deep expertise in corporate culture and leadership. A lot of that time has been transferred through, being a professor at London Business School and consulting and speaking and writing 11 books and publishing over 100 articles in this topic. Can you take us back to what lit the flame for your interest in leadership and corporate culture, and give us a brief overview of your career today?
Quick overview of career. I spent most of my time really as a business school professor, starting in the early 1980s. Alongside that, over the years, I developed a consulting with my partner in crime on most things, called Creative Management Associates. Going back to the flame on leadership and culture, in the early 80s, I was, a long time ago, a young man, struggling to teach MBA students in a business school topics like leadership. I found it very difficult, not least because the leadership research is pretty poor. And really it was that our frustration with what we had on leadership to teach that got me interested in trying to do more. The frustration was around endless lists of characteristics of great leaders that seemed to go forever. A view that the only thing you could say was, contingency theory, good leadership depends on the context. And the third thing I'd say, very frustrating really about this, was a confusion in a lot of the research that leadership was something to do with getting to the top. And it's still the case that you can read a lot of books and research on so-called on leadership, and actually what it's about is getting to the top or being successful at the top, both of which are interesting questions, but they don't necessarily tell you about leadership. I know people at the top of organizations who aren't very good at exciting other people to higher performance, which is our definition of leadership. And I also know people who aren't at the top who are good at exciting other people to higher performance. So it's clearly non-hierarchical. It's nothing to do with where you are at the top, the middle, or the bottom. That's a regular confusion. So that was what got me into the leadership stuff. On the culture stuff, in the early 80s, a very influential book was published called In Search of Excellence, which changed the discussion, I think, at the time, from a lot of talk on strategy and structure and systems, and it introduced this other thing called culture, and it introduced it in a very persuasive kind of way. My background, I'm a sociologist, not a psychologist, and sociologists have always been interested in culture, especially social anthropologists. So I didn't do any persuading that culture was important, and that book got me into that sort of culture interest and played me to some of my biases, I guess.
Brilliant. Fascinating background, and yeah, I can't wait to get into some of those books. Of the 11, there's a few I want to pick on today, but I really want to cover 3 themes that I think, if we have time, that would be of real value to our audience of chief marketing officers and marketing managers. And that is, how can they be a more effective, authentic leader? How can they create a dream workplace to attract and retain a dream team? And if we get time, how can they lead clever people? And I thought to get there, we'll go on a bit of a book odyssey through 3 books which address those topics. So Why Should Anyone Be Led By You? Why Should Anyone Work Here? And Clever, Leading Your Smartest, Most Creative People. Does that sound okay, Rob?
Yeah, sounds like a good plan.
Brilliant. So if we dive into your first book, Why Should Anyone Be Led By You, co-authored with Gareth Jones, as all of these are. I actually understand that the article from that, the HBR article, won a McKinsey award. And it's been, very highly cited article and a very reputable book. But an underlying premise of the book is this notion of authentic leadership, and you've kind of touched on some of that in terms of your inspiration to go into leadership in more detail. But why do you think authentic leadership is so important today, and how do you describe what it is?
The short answer is, I think we've sadly lost faith in our leaders. We don't really trust them as much as we did. You could argue we don't even trust the organizations we work in as much. So there's been a kind of crisis of trust. I think that's the short answer to why that word authentic has crept into our understanding of leadership and is now seen as a kind of vital quality. I think the problem with that word authenticity is it's quite a complex one, and it's often simplified by the way we address it. So for a lot of people, authenticity is be yourself. I think that's kind of just be yourself, and we know who you are. Everything will follow. I think that's very naive advice. I think if you go to an organization or a company and say, here I am, take it or leave it, you'll find some of them may well leave it. So it's more than just being yourself. So in our book, we introduce this kind of little strap line, really, be yourself more with skill. And that means, first of all, think about the things that work for you and help you excite other people to higher performance. But then don't forget the skill factor, the with skill. And what it means is recognize that leadership always takes place in a context and in relationship with others. And guess what? The contexts vary. Leading a marketing team is different from leading a production team. being in one company is different from being in another company. Being in Australia is different from being in the UK. The context always varies. The year 2020, believe me, is a different place, isn't it, from the year 2000?
Yeah, absolutely.
So context is always important, but so is relationships. Leadership is a relationship, and it's a relationship between you and the others, the followers. And so unless you kind of conform enough, as it were, to connect with those you wish to lead, you're kind of spinning wheels. There's no traction. So if you think that notion of connecting and conforming enough to connect, then you understand, I think, that sometimes you have to smooth the edges, as it were, of yourself in order to succeed with your team in a particular context. So that's what being off more with skill means. It means balance your qualities, the context, and the other people you're trying to lead. And that's much more complex balancing act than be yourself.
Yeah, it's a bit easier said than done, isn't it? And a little different, I think when you start in your management career, you perhaps don't really know much about yourself, so you emulate other managers or leaders that you've seen either above you or on television.
Absolutely.
And it's, I guess, through maturity and going deep and understanding what those qualities are that you bring over time, that you learn how to amplify them and perhaps get more confidence to be yourself, and then apply the skill to that in terms of leadership.
Sure.
And the book also talks about these three things, like showing you care, showing vulnerability, and taking risks, and tough empathy. Can you explain a bit more about those three concepts and how they relate to each other and why they're important?
The vulnerability in taking risks. If you say leadership's non-hierarchical, then it's not about the position, it's about the person. So I want to be led by a person, flesh and blood. Well, most people I know are not perfect. So you need to understand at least some, not necessarily all, of their vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And that's part of the risk of leadership, that I think it involves laying a bit of yourself on the line, and being open about some of the things you can't do, as well as some of the things you can do. If leadership is a relationship, it means, I think, something about showing other people what you can't do, because they may be able to do it for you, or they may be able to cover for you. So that's part of the risk vulnerability thing. The idea of sort of tough empathy and really caring and so on comes from the fact that leadership is relational. And if it's relational, you need to understand something about what's the nature of this relationship. And at least part of it is about empathizing. It is something to do with getting under the skin of the people you're trying to lead, seeing the world through their eyes, but at the same time being able to sort of step back a bit. And we tried to allude to this by talking about closeness and distance, and be sometimes close, sometimes distant.
A lot in there. I think, the vulnerability part is, again, probably harder for younger managers to work out, where do I show my vulnerability, and, how to be authentically vulnerable in terms of how to demonstrate that vulnerability. I think in the book you say, you don't want to show your vulnerability if it's core to your role,
Yes.
If you're in that position. But like you say, I think it's about being open and honest where you can't do something that isn't perhaps central to your role, but that you've got a great 2IC or someone else that perhaps can do that. So if you're not, in a marketing context, if you're not the greatest data analyst with Excel, but you still need to know your numbers, perhaps that's an example where you can be a little bit vulnerable and ask for the help from your analysts or performance. Is that how it works, Rob? Or?
Yeah, I think you express it all very well, and a simple way of saying it is it's a bit of trial and error. There will be vulnerabilities, there will be risks. Maybe particularly sensitive to these early in your career. But I think a problem really is that many people therefore say, I'm not going to take these risks, I'm not going to show. Well, I'll wait until I'm senior and older. And by the time you're senior and older, you've lost yourself. You have to learn what works and what doesn't. There are clearly some weaknesses, as you've just said, which are fatal. You can't generalize about which ones are fatal. it's all to do with context, and it's all to do with the skill with which these weaknesses are revealed. Brian Clough in this country is a football manager from years back. Many of your listeners never have heard of him, but he led called Nottingham Forest to win the European Championship twice. No money, resources, average players. An outstanding leader, I think, who excited people to high performance. And he had two weaknesses. One was alcoholism, and the other one was a kind of arrogance, really. Now, would I recommend alcoholism and arrogance weaknesses? No, I wouldn't. But somehow or another, he managed to get away with it. In fact, up to a point, he made some parts of this work for him, such that we liked him even more. That's a kind of magic trick, really. The issue of which qualities do and don't work comes back to your sensitivity about context and the kind of relationships you're in.
Beautiful. And I think the, understanding your staff, again, for marketers, always keen to understand the customer. Be totally customer centric. We have deep segmentation. Talking with the CMO the other day, and they had 84 different segments which all crossed over, and we do personas and we do journey maps, but we perhaps don't spend near enough time or resource on the EX or the employee experience and understanding our employees as well as we understand our customers. But what are some effective ways that that we can get to know our staff, I guess, both formal and informal? What have you found most effective through your research?
Well, I think we sometimes contrast with people that we're working with. What do you know about your colleagues or your followers, in inverted commas? What do you know about their experience or their expertise or their skills? What we tend to find is they know a lot about their experience, their expertise and their skills. And if you look at people's CVs, it's packed with information about this kind of stuff. What it's packed with information about is their emotions, their motives, their values. If leadership's about exciting people to higher performance, if you're in the excitement business as a leader, you need to understand values, motives, and underlying emotions, as it were. And our general feeling is that executives don't spend enough time either thinking about this and digging into the differences between people. The fact is, we know this for sure from the research, that motives amongst executives at work vary. For some it's money, for some it's recognition, for some it's being part of a great team, for some it's the ability to run a team, for some it's the ability to do your own thing. You know all this. What we know is that amongst members of a team, motives will vary. The interesting question is how little, it seems, many executives know about what those motives are. That's the first step. And then secondly, are able to sort of skillfully play to them in terms of the way they try to excite other people as a leader.
And in terms of understanding those motives, then is it as simple as asking your staff in WPPRs, or in your general discussion, or are there personality profiling tools? Are they useful, or is it just a basic human relationship where you really try to understand what motivates them and what they care about?
This is a really good question, and I think directly asking people is probably not a very good idea. I said to you, Tyrone, are you motivated? Are you motivated by money? This isn't a great way of going about things. Can I throw a personality test at you? Yes, I can. But they have their problems too. I think the best way to gather information about this is using your eyes and ears and watching the kind of clues, really, that people are dropping all the time about their motives. And if you become a good detective because whenever I use the word motive, it makes me think of detective novels and stories and so on. And what good detectives do is they pick up the clues that they don't go around to the criminal and say, "Did you do it?" The dramatic finale of that novel or film is always, "You did it, and this is why." I've got I gather the clues that you dropped, and I think that's what managers have got to do. They've got to gather the clues about other people's motives. And we talk a bit about this in the book, and there's a way of doing that in a much more disciplined way than many people seem to find the time for. It takes time. And
yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And you touched on this one before, but I'll just quickly touch on it again before we move into your next book. And that was, and it's probably more, the term in the book was social distancing, which may have a slightly different meaning in a COVID-19 world, but it was this, I guess, tightrope that leaders need to walk between closeness and distance with their staff. What are the pitfalls of going too close to one side, and how do you kind of walk in the middle of that?
So, first of all, your reference to, our contemporary interest in social distance. I'm going to become a pedantic professor now and say that what we're really interested in at the moment in the world is physical distance. And when we talked about social distance, we were talking really about the extent to which, it's back to that word I used earlier on, the extent to which you could empathize with others. And you can empathize with others without being physically close. And you can express a kind of distance from others while you're standing right next to them. So don't confuse social close distance, at least in the way we used it, with physical closeness and distance. Why is leadership about moving between these things? Because you've got to get under the skin, as it were, of the people you're trying to lead and understand them better. And by the way, when you get close, you reveal more about yourself. Good, because we need to see what you are as a human being. So there's a two-way win of getting close. And by stepping back occasionally, or maybe for a fair bit of the time, depending on context, you're able to see the bigger picture. You can take harsher judgments about people's performance at a distance than you can if you're forever close and with the same mindset. So it's always about this movement. And again, I don't want to sound like a record, but that's always determined by context. There's moments when you should be close, moments when you should be apart. One of the compliments paid to that soccer manager was, the players would say he was like one of us, one of the boys, as it were. Could also be like a sergeant major. The ability to move between those two positions skillfully, that's really a leadership skill, I think, but it's not straightforward. And there are cultural variations on this. There are places in the world where the predominant mode is all about being close. And there are other places in the world where it's all about distance and separation and hierarchy. And so you have to play these roles extremely carefully. So you have to be very subtle about this.
Yeah, it is. And I remember reading this book at a time I got promoted, and I think that's one of the times where you really need to be more conscious of that. When you're now leading what were peers and just, how you maintain friendships, but also have enough distance to be able to set objectives and manage performance, I guess, objectively.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant, Rob. Well, thanks for the recap on why should anyone be led by you. Love to now move on to, I guess, a follow-up to that book. And I think, as I understand it, the first book was around how to be a more authentic leader, but you had some feedback from other leaders around, well, I'll be an authentic leader when I'm, when the organization's authentic, and this book digs a bit deeper into that. So another provocative question, why should anyone work here? And there was another provocative question in the book, which was, if you were to design the best workplace on earth, what would that look like? Touching on this COVID-19 again, has, the move to remote work and hybrid work, has the term workplace changed, or are there additional challenges now in creating that dream environment in this, hybrid workplace that we're in? Or does it accentuate any of the findings to begin with?
Well, I think what's happened has led to a discussion about physical presence in workplaces, for sure, and the extent to which we do or don't need that. And I suspect it's meant that, many of us may feel we don't quite need it as much as we did, but we still need it. Maybe in smaller doses. So that's the sort of simple response. But a bigger response, I think, would be when we use that idea of the best workplace on earth, which is a phrase we used when we were writing that book, we weren't necessarily, sorry to be confusing, talking about physical places. We were, I suppose we were talking about work communities that we belong to. And I think the evidence indicates that whether it's virtual, or real, people do want to belong to workplace communities and to identify with it and to allow that sense of a community to give them meaning. And I think none of that has changed because of the pandemic, but it's just raised questions about how do we deliver it. We haven't got the time to do this, but I'll say this very briefly. Yeah. We wrote a book, which we're not going to talk about today, called The Character of a Corporation, where we distinguish cultures according to sociability and solidarity. And sociability, being friendly and liking each other and so on, is typically built through face-to-face interaction. And that's what we've lost because of the pandemic. Solidarity is completely different. It just emerges when you need it. It's your ability to pull together fast in order to win. And in a weird kind of way, the pandemic has strengthened, in a way, social solidarity together to try and defeat this thing, at least up until now. Whether that lasts is an interesting question. So the solidarity side has to some extent been built, but the sociability side has been undermined. And that's what we're trying to get back.
In the summary, I guess, to get to a dream workplace, you've got a nice dream mnemonic. Can you just briefly touch on each of those, and then we might dig into one or two in a bit more detail?
Yes. Well, first of all, apologies for the kind of cheesy mnemonic, but we were just trying to get a way of helping people to remember these 5 or 6 things that we got interested in. So the basic question, as you just said, was, okay, I'll be authentic when the organization is authentic. So we started asking people, well, what is your perfect organization? What's this best place to work? And that's how we came up with the Dreams mnemonic. When we asked that question around the world, by the way, not just with executives, but everyone that works in organizations, obviously they said different things, but to some extent there were some commonalities. And that's what we tried to summarize with the Dreams mnemonic. So I'll go through it quickly because time is short, but the D in Dreams stands for diversity or difference. And what we actually said in the book was what we need is organizations which are good at having difference beyond diversity. We all know the kind of diversity we should have, but we were talking about mindset differences, which are extremely important. And that came out of people saying, I want to go somewhere where I can be myself. Well, you can only be yourself in places where difference is tolerated, maybe even celebrated. That's D. R stands for radical honesty. Radical honesty. People said, I want to work somewhere where I know what's going on, where they don't pull the wool over my eyes, they tell the truth, or to use a phrase increasingly relevant these days, I get told the truth as quickly as possible. Tell the truth before someone else does for you. And that's what the social media world, and that's what we meant by radical honesty, proactively sharing information fast and openly, or as openly as you can. E is DRE. E stands for extra value. I'd like to work somewhere, people said, where I'm going to get better, I'm going to develop skills, I'm going to develop my strengths, I'm going to become even maybe a better person. So it wasn't just skills. So that was the E for extra value. Very important in terms of, the so-called war for talent. Can I go somewhere where I'm going to get even more valuable, extra value? A stands for authenticity. I want to work somewhere where I believe in what we stand for. And what we stand for is in our DNA, it's in our roots. It's not just in some ever-changing mission statement that doesn't mean anything. M stands for meaning. I want meaningful work, which kind of connects to the higher purpose of the organization. And lots of people can do so-called mundane work and get satisfaction from it. But what they often don't get is a connection between what they're doing and the ultimate purpose. And what we were talking about with M for meaning. And the final one, S, is for simple rules. People said they wanted to work somewhere where they weren't drowning in was another S really, but they wanted simple. They didn't want to drown in bureaucracy, didn't want to be in an organization where, the rule books just got bigger and bigger. And this was a very big complaint in the people we spoke to. So that last one was simple rules. So that's list, DREAMS, and that's what we tried to look at in the book in terms of which organisations were practising these.
Brilliant. Okay, I'd love to pick on a few of those if we have time. Starting with the extra value, I think updating and upgrading the staff that we work for in a knowledge economy is critical. Staff want to be updated, upgraded, and to learn new things, to retain them, and organisations need them to do that. So what was one or two companies that were really good at adding extra value back to their organisations, or back to the individuals, sorry?
Well, I think I'm going to say something fairly unrevolutionary here. A lot of, so-called professional service firms are very good, I think, at investing in their staff and developing their skills. So I'm not going to single any of those in particular out. One of the organisations which may be a surprise to people that we talked about in the book was McDonald's. Because when people think about extra value, they tend to think about professional skills, and they tend to think about senior executives, or at least middle managers. I think you've got to think about the whole organisation and the extent to which value is added. In the UK, at least, McDonald's is one of the biggest deliverers of skill training to so-called lower level service operatives. I don't know why they don't say more about this in public, because they often get some bad press, I guess, about some of what they're selling and so on. But that's a surprising example for some of your listeners or viewers. We also talked in the book about a UK organisation, John Lewis, which owns a supermarket called Waitrose. I said just now that people wanted extra value, not just in terms of skills, but in terms of who they were and their selves. And, Waitrose pays for shop floor operative service workers in their stores to have singing lessons, or if they like playing the piano, they'll pay for piano lessons. I like going into Waitrose is when I get served, I feel I'm being at the cash out. I feel I'm being served by a person who talks to me and I talk to them. And I say that's not always the feeling I get from visiting supermarkets and the experience at the till as you cash out. But and I think that is something to do with putting in to people that we wouldn't normally think about. Yeah,
it is so different, isn't it? It's really developing their whole self and thinking beyond just what's the skill they need to be a cashier, as to how can I improve this person's life and help them develop as a person, and then they'll bring their whole self back to their work.
Correct.
And then one other one I'll touch on here is the radical honesty. So I know, in the pandemic, there's, a lot of industries being really deeply affected by this, and there'll be a lot of chief marketing officers and marketing managers that'll be looking at downsizing or restructuring their team. And I know it's a common challenge that you have, where you need to go through that process of working out how best to do that. But staff need answers, and you've always got a choice of how much do I engage staff and when do I engage them in this process, to at least say, change is coming or needs to be had. And there's usually two schools of thought. One, that you bring them in and you get their involvement to help solve that challenge and work through the outcomes together. And the other is, I guess, you say what you can, but you almost need to do things behind closed doors until you've got a plan to put on the page to reduce some of the anxiety around that not knowing. So I don't know what the perfect answer to this is, but I guess the question is, how do you display this radical honesty when you don't know all the answers, and you know that change is coming that will affect the team, but you're unsure how much of that to disclose?
Well, that's another good question, to which I don't think there are simple, easy answers. And again, we're back to context and how that shapes things. I think generally the default mode, especially in a social media type world, is to share information. That should be the default mode, and to treat people like adults. People don't appreciate not being treated like adults. And I think if you don't know everything, well, I think you should probably admit to that. Probably what people are looking at, this relates, by the way, to the pandemic as well. We clearly don't know everything, and we don't know everything that works in terms of addressing it. But I think what people want to hear is at least a plan. And if you look around the world, I think some governments, New Zealand looks pretty good, and the leadership you're getting in New Zealand, it does look as if they have a plan.
Yeah.
Now, are they going to be able to control everything? No, I doubt it, but they do look as if they've got a plan. And in places in the world where there's less satisfaction with the leadership that's being shown at the moment, it doesn't look as if there is a plan. But I do think, admit you don't have all the answers. Do get a plan if you can. Generally, default mode, treat people like adults, unless there's very good reasons not to, or, the information is a source of competitive advantage that's, there's clearly cases you have to hold stuff back.
Yeah.
But I think generally be as open as you can be.
Just for the last one on that book, before we race on to the next one, for the CMO listening that wants to create this dream workplace, where should they start, or does it depend? Like, I assume it's not as simple as working through the mnemonics one by one. How do they identify what is the first thing to do, or contextually evaluate what is the first thing to address?
The slightly depressing thing we found in the book was that when you looked at large organizations, at least, they found it difficult to be brilliant on DREAMS. Good often on 2 or 3, and not so good on a couple of the others. And that obviously should be the area perhaps they should do a little bit of work on. That's the first simple thing to say. By the way, the organizations best at delivering DREAMS tended to be smaller organizations, or organizations which, rather like John Lewis, had different ownership structures and were therefore free of what you might call the short-term pressures of share capitalism. So large capitalist organizations, business companies, often find it difficult addressing everything in that list. Okay, so get real, focus on what's important for you now. A year or two back, if I were in VW, after the emissions scandal, I would have thought radical honesty might be quite a significant item in that little list to address.
Yes.
If I'm finding it hard to attract talented people, scarce in the labour market, extra value is going to be quite important, I suspect. If I'm in creative areas, and a lot of your people in this network will be in creative areas, the diversity thing is, that difference. Are we allowing difference in our teams and in our organizations? I think that's incredibly important, because what we know is, diversity, creativity increases with diversity. But of course, diversity is difficult to manage. So that's also a balancing act. But I think it is about what's important for us now and going forward, and what's costing us, if you see what I mean, and let's pay some attention.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I agree that diversity one is huge in creative industries. And can be such a powerful differentiator. So quickly on to the last book then, Clever Leading Your Smartest, Most Creative People. I guess one of the central tenets of this is that clever people don't like to be led. Can you start with what is meant by clever people, and explain why they don't like to be led?
We use the word clever as a kind of provocation, because in most languages, many languages anyway, the idea of clever is kind of double-edged, not always a positive attribute, and too clever by half, or not as clever as he or she thinks they are, that kind of stuff. So it's a deliberately provocative term, and makes us think a bit about precisely what does clever mean. We got interested really because a lot of those quite slightly difficult clever people, we think they're going to become more and more important in so-called knowledge economies. If we are all headed towards knowledge economies, then expect organizations and teams to be more and more full of clever people. And those clever people are the ones most likely to ask the question, why should I be led by you? In other words, least likely to be interested in hierarchies and what the boss says. So our sort of flip, or rather glib sort of definition of who's clever or what's clever was people who think they're cleverer than you and don't want to be led. Now, by the way, think they're cleverer than you, they often aren't. And think they don't want to be led, they often do want to be led, but in different kinds of ways. But if you want me to be serious about these clever people in terms of our definition, what we said, and I think it's true, these are people who are a source of disproportionate value given resources which the organisation makes available. So who is it that gives you most value given the resources allocated? Everyone, not just the clever people in R&D or the clever people in a professional service consulting firm or the clever people in a pharmaceutical company. They're kind of all conventionally clever, but there's clearly clever people in marketing teams, in production teams, on the shop floor. They're all over organizations. These are people who kind of save you. They're people who are really, really, really valuable in your team. And that's who we were really trying to look at in this book. But as I say, in general, they can be quite difficult. And in a way, they'd rather work for themselves, a lot of them, and do their own thing.
Yeah. So if you're a CMO listening to this and you can maybe identify some of those in your team, you still want to engage these staff and you want to lead them as best you can with skill. But what can you do as a leader then to keep these people engaged? Because, in a talent war, you want to retain them. What can a leader do?
We wrote an article in Harvard Business Review, and the clever editors of the magazine gave the article a subtitle. The subtitle was "Be a Benevolent Guardian," and that's a pretty good summary, I think, of what a lot of it is about. A benevolent guardian. In other words, you've got to kind of look after these people. You've got to resource them. You've got to almost pamper them. You've got to give them space, time, recognition of their wonderful achievements. Leave them alone quite a lot of the time. So that's a kind of benevolence. And the guardian bit is, keep them out of the way of all the horrible organizational politics, which they're sensitive to and get fed up with. And it's the reason they don't want to be there in the first place. And all of that stuff. Where that little subtitle got it wrong was it's not just about benevolence and guardianship. It's also about discipline. And discipline about targets, about behaviors, about how you operate with other people. You need to balance this kind of kindness with a kind of discipline. And I think it's a really hard thing to do with leading clever people. But unless you have some kind of professional or organizational or discipline can come from culture, the values and so on, and introduce this to them, they can sort of run riot and they can be a source of huge added value. They can very quickly become a source of huge value loss, and you've only got to look at what has happened in several financial sector disasters to see that clever people can lose you a lot of money very quickly unless properly disciplined. So that is the key, I think.
Yeah, brilliant. And I guess some managers may be concerned that it looks like these people are getting almost special treatment, or those that aren't getting that. How do you overcome that as a leader, where it may appear that way because you really do want to retain these high-performing staff? How do you address that?
Yeah, that's really difficult, isn't it? You keep asking questions to which there are no neat answers. It's a sign of a good question and a good interview, I think. But I think it's really hard. You've only got to follow sort of sports teams to see that coaches all the time are trying this balance, aren't they, between indulging and looking after the superstar or the superstars, and at the same time keeping the workhorses happy in the team. And I think the same thing happens at work. I think to some extent it is about communicating to everyone really what you're doing, why you're doing it. And it's about toleration, I think, up to a point. And then there comes a point where you say, sorry, your ill discipline is now costing the team too much.
Yeah.
So you've got to go.
Yeah.
And that's just a judgment call, really, in the situation.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Thanks, Rob. Okay. Well, we've come to the end of the book Odyssey. We've got 5 minutes left, Rob. I thought we might quickly jump to the Fast Five, if that's okay.
Sure.
So, Rob, what do you believe are 3 essential capabilities or criteria of a high-performance team?
Really simple, clear goals, clear roles, and good rituals. In other words, teams are about getting stuff done, but they're also about social togetherness. And by the way, those little rituals, some of them we're missing a lot at the moment. But
Yeah. What's one metric you've successfully seen used to track and measure team performance?
It's kind of linked to what I just said. I think if you can make those goals measurable, that's a simple thing to do. The other thing, I would say this, wouldn't I, as a OB, Organisation Behaviour Professor, but I do think 360 feedback inside the team over, periods, regularity is a very good metric for just making sure everything's working okay.
Yeah, brilliant. And what's one skill or capability you've learned recently that you wish you'd developed much sooner in your career?
I don't think I learned this recently, but I didn't learn it early enough. Stand-up communication, the ability to stand up and talk to people. Vital, I think, obviously for business school professors, but I think pretty important in day-to-day life, really, and in a way that I hadn't properly appreciated. And it is I think it's a skill, and it doesn't come easily. I'm naturally an introvert, and that kind of stuff doesn't come easy, and it requires work, but it is a skill, I think.
It is.
You can get better at quite quickly.
Absolutely, to get that presence and authority, and one question: what is one word that you'd use to describe the culture of a high-performing team? Can you boil it down to one word?
I really struggle with this because I don't think I can. But if I can use 2 words, the 2 words would be win and fun. In other words, great teams that I've been in, they win. In other words, they get stuff done, but they're fun to be. So winning and fun, they're all fun to be in. I've been in teams which are fun, but they never get anything done.
Yeah.
And I've been in teams which win and they're miserable.
Yeah.
So I think, and any great sports team that anyone's been in, that's what they are. They're fun to be in and they win.
Yeah, good combination. And lastly, we've covered a lot of books that you've read, but is there one that you've written, is there one that you've read that found yourself recommending to others that you think our listeners may also get value from?
I think on leadership, let's just talk about leadership. There's a great book, I think, written by Warren Bennis. It's called an American professor, sadly not alive anymore, but it's called On Becoming a Leader. It's published a long time ago, still incredibly readable, very influential for me in terms of my thinking about leadership. And in terms of the times we live in, he advised, I think, several American presidents.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. Thanks, Rob. Well, Rob, thank you so much for your time today. Where can people go to either get in touch with you or find more about yourself, your books, your teaching, your company, Creative Management Associates?
So either through the London Business School website and my email address there, where I remain an Emeritus Professor, or through our consulting company, creativemanagementassociates.com.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much. It's been so nice to connect again, and thanks for making the time.
Very nice to see you again, and thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Lean Mean Marketing Teams, brought to you by Growth Generators. To say thanks, we've packaged up all those tips, strategies and resources into some beautifully crafted notes just for you, so you can spend more time taking action and less time taking notes. To grab the notes, head on over to growthgenerators.io, look out for this podcast episode and download the notes. But be quick, they're only live for a few weeks after the episode airs.